From the beginning of 2022, just before the Ukraine conflict started, up to July 2024, Russia has been making significant amounts of money from selling various types of fossil fuels. The biggest moneymaker for them was natural gas sent through pipelines, which brought in about 285 million euros daily, totaling approximately 104 billion euros annually, equivalent to about $115 billion. A lot of this gas used to go to Europe, but now they also send huge amounts to China. The second largest source of income was selling crude oil, which is just oil pumped from the ground and sold as is. Russia earned 250 million euros daily from this, amounting to 91 billion euros for the year, or about $100 billion. Refined oil products like gasoline, diesel, and kerosene processed from crude oil into more valuable products were the third biggest earners, bringing in 232 million euros daily and about 85 billion euros annually, roughly $94 billion. Liquefied natural gas, LNG, which is natural gas cooled down and turned into liquid for overseas shipment, was the fourth largest revenue stream. It generated 88 million euros each day, adding up to 32 billion euros for the year, or about $35 billion. Coal, also a significant export, brought in 54 million euros daily, resulting in an annual income of 20 billion euros, or around $22 billion. So at the start of 2022, Russia was pulling in roughly 910 million euros each day from these exports, which means they were making about $1 billion every single day. This diversification in export types highlights the range and reach of Russia's fossil fuel market. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, there's been a big change in the world of fossil fuels. Right after the invasion, people everywhere were worried about what would happen to the global supply of oil, gas, and coal. This concern drove prices up sharply. Initially, this actually caused Russia's earnings from these resources to soar. By April 2022, Russia was making $1.4 billion a day from fossil fuels, a 40% jump from January of the same year. Oil and pipeline gas saw the biggest increases. Daily earnings from oil exports jumped to 400 million euros, a 60% increase, and pipeline gas went up to 350 million euros per day, up by 23%. However, the situation changed dramatically over the next 2 years. As various countries imposed sanctions on Russian fossil fuels, Russia's total earnings started to drop. By July 2024, oil was still the top earner, bringing in about 250 million euros a day, the same as before the war started. Refined oil products were next, earning about 200 million euros a day, down by 14% from January 2022. Coal exports, interestingly, went up about 30%, earning around 70 million euros a day. The biggest hit was to the gas sector. Revenue from pipeline gas exports dropped from 285 million euros a day before the invasion to just 60 million euros, a drop of 80%. Sales of liquefied natural gas also fell dramatically, from 88 million euros to about 20 million euros per day, down by 77%. Russia's daily income from fossil fuels is now around $660 million compared to $1 billion before the war. There's a decrease of $340 million each day. When you take a look at the peak times, this daily revenue is down by $740 million. Annually, that's a loss of about $270 billion. This gives a clear picture of how deeply the conflict in Ukraine has affected Russia's financial intake from its fossil fuels. However, what's intriguing is the volume of fossil fuels Russia is exporting, which has remained relatively consistent since early 2022. Let's look into the details. In January 2022, Russia was making about 250 million euros per day from crude oil exports. Fast forward to today, and the daily earnings are similar, even though the world has changed a lot. Over the past 2.5 years, the amount of crude oil Russia exports hasn't really changed and has stayed pretty much the same. Now, looking at refined oil products, there's been a shift. Back in January 2022, Russia exported about 388 million tons of refined products per day. Today, that number has dropped to 297 million tons. Despite the decrease in volume, the financial hit is substantial, with daily earnings dropping from €232 million to €200 million, marking an annual loss of around €11 billion. The pipeline gas scenario sheds light on the effects of international sanctions. While the volume of gas Russia exports has decreased by about 50% from 322 million tons per day down to 15 million, the income from these exports has plummeted by about 80%. This means the gas still being sold through Russian pipelines, mainly to China, is going at much lower prices than before the war. China, known for driving hard bargains, is now a primary buyer at these reduced rates. Coal tells a slightly different story. Before the war, Russia was exporting 422 million tons per day, and now that number is increased to 450 million tons. This uptick matches the rise in revenue from coal over the same period. As for liquefied natural gas, there's been a significant reduction. In January 2022, Russia was exporting 109 million tons of LNG per day, but today that's fallen to about 51 million tons. This halving of the export volume is partly due to losing customers because of sanctions and operational challenges stemming from lost partnerships with Western companies. So while Russia's total revenue from fossil fuels has dropped dramatically due to lower prices and sanctions, the actual amount of fossil fuels leaving the country remains surprisingly steady, aside from specific categories like LNG and refined products. From January 2022 to July 2024, the pattern of who buys Russian crude oil has seen major changes, reflecting shifts in global politics and trade. Initially, in January 2022, Western countries accounted for 69% of all Russian crude oil sales. At that time, China made up 27% of this purchase, while India was not importing any Russian crude oil at all. However, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was a substantial drop in the amount of crude oil bought by Western nations due to imposed sanctions. Although this reduction wasn't immediate, since European countries faced challenges in quickly finding alternative oil suppliers, the decline became more pronounced over time. Securing millions of barrels of oil from new sources required complex logistical arrangements which couldn't happen overnight. Over the past 2 years, there's been a notable shift in where Russia's crude oil is going. One of the most dramatic changes has been the surge in purchases by India. This increase in demand from India has somewhat compensated for the reduced buying by Western countries. The decline in Western purchases and the rise in Indian buying highlights a broader trend of realigning global trade networks with significant impacts on total revenue from Russia's crude oil sales. However, in recent months, there has been a noticeable decline in India's crude oil purchases from Russia, primarily due to the growing concern over secondary sanctions. Over the last half-year, the United States and Europe have intensified efforts to enforce sanctions on companies interacting with sanctioned Russian entities. This has posed many challenges for countries like India and China, where trade with Russia constitutes only a small fraction of their overall exports. The potential repercussions of secondary sanctions have led to a cautious approach, resulting in reduced oil purchases from Russia. Despite these challenges, the total revenue Russia is earning from its oil exports as of the end of July remains roughly on par with figures from January 2022. However, the composition of the buyers has shifted. China now accounts for about 25% of all Russian oil purchases, maintaining its share from before the Ukraine conflict began. In contrast, India, which has increased its imports substantially, has now become Russia's largest customer, accounting for about 38% of all purchases. Although this is a decrease from earlier in 2024, when India's share exceeded 50%, Turkey is the third largest customer, representing around 11%. 25% of Russia's total recorded revenue also currently comes from unspecified sales involving the dark shipping fleet. These tankers turn off the transponders to avoid detection and continue trading despite sanctions. Western countries are intensifying efforts to identify and intercept these dark tankers to significantly reduce Russia's income from such undisclosed transactions. The revenue from the sale of refined oil products has also dropped a lot since January 2022. Western countries, historically the primary buyers, have dramatically reduced their purchases, although they still account for about a quarter of Russia's total sales. This is partly because some European countries are landlocked and rely on pipelines for their oil supplies, making it difficult for them to find alternative sources quickly. Turkey has emerged as Russia's second-largest customer for refined oil products, making up about 16% of total sales, followed by Brazil with around 12%. India and China are smaller buyers in this category, each accounting for about 6% of sales. The remaining unaccounted-for sales are likely tied to the dark tanker fleet, a method increasingly targeted by Western efforts to clamp down on Russia's attempts to circumvent sanctions. Continuing the discussion about Russia's dark tanker fleet, these are old and often poorly maintained tankers used to transport some of its oil. A look at the distribution of ships by ownership and insurance reveals some huge changes over the past few years, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine. Initially, a large portion of ships transporting Russian oil were either owned or insured by the European Union and G7 countries, making up 60% of the fleet. Another 13% were insured by Norway, meaning that nearly three-quarters of the ships Russia used were tied to Western countries. However, by the end of July 2024, this figure has drastically dropped. Now, only 16% of the ships used to transport Russian crude oil are owned or insured by the Western groups. This leaves 84% of the shipments being carried out through other means, predominantly by Russia's dark tanker fleet. These tankers are old and often have limited insurance. Many operate covertly by turning off their transponders, making them difficult to track. This shift is very important because the maritime industry is largely dominated by Western countries, which historically have been major seafaring nations. The shipping industry still relies heavily on Western technology and infrastructure. The move away from Western insured and owned ships is largely because these ships are subject to a price cap imposed by the West as part of sanctions against Russia. This strategy of using less traceable ships poses a challenge for Russia, but is also a major focus for Western countries aiming to tighten sanctions. They are actively working to track and limit the operations of these dark tankers to cut back on Russia's oil exports that bypass international restrictions. Under the current price cap rules, any ship transporting Russian oil must certify that the transaction was conducted at less than $60 per barrel. Russia, however, prefers selling its oil at higher prices, like $70 or $80 per barrel. Consequently, Russia is increasingly using ships that are not owned or insured by Western countries to bypass these sanctions. In January 2022, the transportation of refined oil products was largely similar to crude oil, with 76% of oil-refined products being shipped on vessels owned or insured by the EU and the G7 and other 10% managed by Norway. This totaled 86% of Russia's oil exports being transported on Western-owned or insured ships. Over the past 2.5 years, there has been a reduction in the use of Western ships for transporting refined oil products, though it's less pronounced compared to crude oil. By July 2024, about 61% of refined oil product shipments still used Western-owned or insured ships, representing around two-thirds of the total. This relatively high percentage persists because refined oil products are of higher value and Russia seems more willing to comply with the $100 per barrel price cap set for refined products compared to the lower cap for crude oil. The volume of refined products transported is also significantly less than that of crude oil, affecting the logistical choices and the strategies for circumventing the price caps.